Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight my guests are two co-workers in the fight for Oklahoma Indian languages, both of whom happen to be board members of the Intertribal Wordpath Society, along with me. Maybe it'd be worth mentioning the mission of the society for those of you who aren't members or aren't very familiar with it. Intertribal Wordpath Society is a nonprofit organization. Our purpose is to promote the teaching, awareness, use, and status of Oklahoma Indian languages. And I think we'll touch on several of those points tonight in the discussion. Let me introduce my guest next. First of all, I have Richard Grounds, who is Yuchi and Seminole. He's a professor of anthropology at the University of Tulsa, and he teaches a course in Indian language preservation, right on topic here. He's also been involved for about 6 years in Yuchi language classes in the Yuchi community, and he's worked with the United Nations Decade of the World's Indigenous People, which has included recognition of the importance of indigenous languages. Finally, he's an advisor to the World Council of Churches Indigenous Peoples Program. Welcome, Richard. Glad to have you here.
Sanlakayasata. Richard Grounds Ezeti. Yuchi ha zet yada. Seminole ha zet yada. Kushing he deep bajin. Wiga insha abe. I was saying that I'm Richard Grounds. My nation is Yuchi and Seminole. I was born over around Cushing, and was giving a greeting and asking how it was going. How you doing?
Wonderful, and I'm doing fine, and thank you for coming to the program. Let me now introduce my other guest, Margaret Mauldin, who's Muskogee. She teaches Creek language courses at OU and has been doing this for 5 years now. She's also co-author of a Creek dictionary, which will be appearing in June of this year, published by University of Nebraska Press. And she has an ongoing Creek hymn project, originally planned for 3 books with accompanying tapes, and now I think there's going to be a 4th number as well. Welcome, Margaret. Thanks for coming.
Mado. Glad to be here. Mahaya Jahojifkados. I tell my students to call me Mahaya, which means teacher. And I think that I deserve that title because I'm totally committed to the language, and I always want to be recognized by my students that I am their teacher, I was their teacher, and for other people to realize that that's what I do. And this is a good thing.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Now, we've titled this program Valuing Our Languages. I did a show once called Who is We that talks about sometimes the hidden or ambiguous meanings, especially in English, of a word like we or our. There are actually 2 meanings that we might touch on tonight in the sense, our languages in the sense of each of my guests belongs to their own Indian community, and they're going to talk about their own respective languages and their own communities. But also there's a broader sense that you could read this title, which is that since this show addresses Oklahoma Indian languages, our languages in the sense of the languages of the state of Oklahoma, and I guess I would be included in that sense of our because I'm an Oklahoman, but not of either of these tribes or any other. And I think from all of these points of view, it's important to value Indian languages. And I wanted to say one other thing before we kind of launch into this, what I think is going to be a pretty freewheeling discussion, I hope. And that is, to a lot of people, I guess especially non-Indians or people who have not been involved in Indian community language work, it might seem like this whole question of Indian language preservation is a question of us and them. You know, us being the Indian people, we want to preserve our languages. Them being the white people, they don't want to let us do it, you know. And I think pretty quickly in tonight's discussion we'll see that it's not nearly that simple. And I think it's important to have 2 people from 2 different Indian communities here to be able to give their perspectives on this question. So, let me start off, Richard, by kind of quoting back a phrase that you gave me when we were discussing earlier this evening what we would talk about in the show. You said there's a problem of our own children not always seeing the importance of Indian languages. Tell us about that.
Well, I think one of our biggest difficulties is getting our own children motivated enough to get the support from the parents in the home or from grandparents. I guess one of the more striking examples or instances of how this problem bothers me a lot is sometimes in our struggle, our effort to get children to come to been working in our case with the Yuchi language classes, and we offer to go and pick kids up. We offer a meal at the time they're there. We have all kinds of prizes that they can win by the games that we play, little incentives. We prefer to call them as opposed to bribes. And so we do what we can to really try to work to get people there. But it's if you compare it, sometimes I think about the effort that a lot of times some of our children, our own community children, may be even more active in going to some kind of a scouting event where they may be learning kind of pseudo or kind of pretend Indian things, and they may be more easily involved in that than coming and learning their own language from our elders, and that's part of the frustration. But just one other quick comment: when you were talking about the ambiguity of our language, what does that in English especially, the way you said that reminded me in Yuchi language, when we talk about us, it can mean we have an inclusive us, that would be us, everyone we're talking to included, or an exclusive us, where it's just, it doesn't include the people we're talking to, but it's just us here. So. Right.
That's how I got onto that topic for an earlier show, because the same kind of thing happens in Comanche. Yeah. So now, I don't know, we want to be careful that we're here to celebrate Indian languages and Indian people and so forth. I don't know, I'm just imagining someone might have heard some of your comments just now and thought, well, you mean even the Yuchi people don't want to save their own language? Well, what's going on here? I mean, you seem to be describing some kind of resistance, or is it maybe just not setting priorities the way you wish some people would? What is it that you're fighting against in trying to get these kids to come to class more?
Well, to some extent, that is the larger question, and I don't claim to have all the answers. And I don't mean to make it sound as if there aren't people in the community that are really working hard and trying to make a go of passing forward the languages. But in the larger picture, I think that we are up against some very difficult odds. A lot of things in the society, historically, a lot of things were done intentionally to suppress the languages. But now we live in, for many of our communities, in conditions where a lot of things may not be done so much intentionally to rub out the languages, but there's a lot of things that make it difficult to keep the languages going. And sometimes our children may not feel comfortable because you stick out if you're speaking your language. If you're in the grocery store and someone speaks to you, as I do when I see any of our community members, then it may be a little awkward for them to.
So it sort of sounds like you're saying that to a young Yuchi person, it's not necessarily something they associate with doing the popular thing, to just be speaking Yuchi. It doesn't come easily and naturally for them to think, oh yes, we need to do that. We need to spend a lot of time learning to do that. Wouldn't that be great?
Well, but again, to use the scouting analogy, I think in our society there's a great deal of prestige attached to earning badges in a scouting group. A lot of recognition that's attached to that. It's something that's very proud. It may appear in the local newspaper. But for someone working in our own languages, really learning the living traditions, it's hard to match that kind of prestige. It's hard to get that kind of recognition for that hard work and success.
Margaret, let me ask you, are you relating to some of this? For Creek children, Muskogee children, is it a popular thing to want to learn their language of heritage?
No, it isn't.
And why not? Help us to understand this a little better.
Well, there are several factors, starting with the parents and their busy lives. And the children are separated by a wide gap between their grandparents and themselves. And the parent is busy working every day, and they don't really have time to do language. However, the child will have time to sit in front of the TV for hours. And the children have heroes that are not Indians. And this is all they're interested in. And
What kind of heroes are you thinking of?
well, of course, Pokemon.
Yeah.
You might not call them a hero,
Well,
but they're just,
They occupy a lot of their
yes,
attention, though.
the new things, they know all about this, but they don't know anything about their culture. And we can't change that much. You can have the desire. An individual can have the desire to teach the language and do everything they can to do this. But until the people themselves realize who they are, and if that's who they want to be, they have got to do language, and that the language must pass as the mother tongue to the child. And this isn't being done. You've got that grandmother-grandchild gap, and the parent between may understand the language perfectly. So the parent comes home from work and grandma says, little grandchild here needs this or did this, and then the parent turns to the child and speaks to the child in English. And so we never really connect up the three generations. And it's the parent where the gap is. So until we can really realize that and know that language is who we are, we do have a very, very tough battle on our hands as teachers.
So, and of course, that's one reason I read the mission statement of the Intertribal Wordpath Society. Part of our idea is to promote the status and the use and the awareness of Indian languages, not only among Indian people, but that's, as I think you're both saying, that's the beginning, that's the priority we really need to focus on. Promoting it among the general public so that they realize how important they are is good too, but if any of this teaching is going to be effective, you've got to make it kind of a popular thing that the kids want to do. We've talked a lot about, in our meetings at Intertribal Wordpath Society, about ways that this might be done. Of course, there are lots of other things in our culture, in our general, broader Oklahoma culture that are popularized in commercials and all kinds of media, movies and whatnot. And in fact, some of them use a lot of Indian symbols to promote things. And it's kind of ironic that we're sitting here kind of scratching our heads trying to say, okay, how can we make this kind of promotion work for the languages themselves? And so much of the culture hangs on the languages. It's just really, this idea of promotion is really, really important. And we've been focusing on that more in our meetings lately. I know, Margaret, you mentioned this littering ad that was on TV a few years ago. Can you kind of explain what you said about that? You drew a comparison.
Well, it was a national ad showing Iron-Eyes Cody looking over the land and seeing trash scattered about, and this tear falls from his cheek, and I can feel the same way when I think about the language. I listen and I look, and that's exactly how I feel. I like to do a national campaign like that and say, the languages, where are they? I don't hear them anymore.
And then that tear.
There'd be more than one tear.
Yes, there sure would be. Well, speaking of promotion and so forth, Richard, maybe you can address another topic we were talking about this afternoon. This is sort of in the sense of the hour, in that Oklahoma is where these languages are, and I think all Oklahomans have some responsibility, or certainly the government should have some responsibility in helping promote Indian cultures and at least stemming the loss of Indian culture and language. Now, I've talked to a lot of people in different tribes who have felt a little embittered by the fact that the state uses Indian symbology, pictures of lots of people in feathers, twirling feathers and dancing and so forth, and a kind of Indian, or maybe it's pseudo-Indian music, Indian flute certainly being used in some of the tourism department ads. Some people are embittered by that because they feel like, well, we're being used to promote the state, but what are we actually getting from the state? And we could do 6 or 8 shows on that probably. But one of the things we've talked about is we, as a Intertribal Wordpath Society, we'd like to talk to the tourism department and see if we can't find some common ground and get some language in some of their ads and so forth. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, just to affirm the concern that you're raising, that certainly we need to move beyond the kind of easy, simple Hollywood Indian images.
Right.
What's really rich, that which is irreplaceable, that which cannot be found anyplace else on the planet, are our indigenous languages.
Right.
It's a rich heritage. It goes back millennia, thousands of years. And if we don't carry it forward, if we don't pass it on to the next generation, then that rich intellectual tradition, that whole way of knowing, of speaking the world, will be something of the past. So it is both our own distinctive heritage, which I think needs to be understood, that it's not just the generic Indian, brand X Indian, but we are specific nations with specific languages, specific traditions, and to support that. And I think certainly it would help to have, maybe to take advantage of the effort on the part of the state of Oklahoma to call attention to Oklahoma as Native America. What does that mean? If we're really Native America, then we need our native languages. And to promote the idea that these languages are a rich part not only of our specific communities, but in some ways it's part of our rich heritage for all Oklahomans and really for the world. It's a rich part of our human heritage as well, I think.
Yeah, and I think this isn't, I mean, I'm not here to pick a fight with the tourism department. I know there are plenty of people out there that are ready to. I would like to look at it as constructively as possible. And I was mentioning this afternoon in our talk that Louisiana, I haven't seen these recently, but a year or two ago they started a big campaign where they had a lot of promotional advertisements to try to attract tourism to the state of Louisiana. And in every one of them, there was some kind of Cajun or Creole French terminology, and they used that as a way of drawing your attention and making you more interested in the state. And I thought they were very nicely done. I don't see why we couldn't do something like that in Oklahoma. Because the ads that are done are very professionally produced. I mean, I have no quibble with their production values and so forth. I think they leave out so much of what it is to be Oklahoman. That's all I can say about it.
And the other important aspect, I suppose, in terms of thinking about perhaps promoting at a statewide level possible legislation or getting more direct institutional support, is that Native Americans are taxpayers. We're working
Absolutely.
Community members, and it's our tax dollars that we're asking to have spent to address our own needs as
Right.
active working members of the state, as citizens of this
Right.
state. So I think that's important for people to
Yeah.
recognize as well. This isn't a welfare kind of
Right,
situation.
exactly. And as a non-Indian Oklahoman, I have to say I value diversity, cultural and linguistic diversity and all kinds of diversity. I think that it enriches us all to know who our neighbors are and what's going on in this state. I think the average non-Indian Oklahoman probably vastly underestimates how much Indian culture and language are still here, how important they are to people. And then I think some of the problem with getting Indian children involved or getting parents to bring their children to program may be sort of a spillover of that general society attitude that's just sort of letting things slip, and we kind of each live in our own world and we know our own family, and we're not addressing the diversity of the state as a whole and the fact that a lot of different kinds of Oklahomans are paying those taxes.
Yes.
And should get something for them.
Well, and I think it's both perhaps a failure to recognize the diversity, as you're saying, certainly, but also a lot of the struggle to promote our languages and to carry them forward. I'm not sure that so many people in the state who may not be Native Americans really understand how urgent the crisis is.
Right.
They haven't been given the information. They are not aware that perhaps the very last speakers of a particular language may be living in their town or their
Right.
neighborhood.
I know. It's amazing.
And they don't realize how critical it is. And I think a lot of people of goodwill, a lot of people who would care, would speak out and would support if they even knew about it. But we need to, I think, even begin to get the message out to inform people of the crisis, the extreme
Right.
crisis that we're
Yeah, and
in.
you're not overstating it one bit. I know that you're not. Margaret, what is the role of tribal governments in all of this? We've talked about the state government.
Well, I believe that they have a huge responsibility, and we should be able to make our government take that role of responsibility, but we can't do it until we ourselves realize that just being born Indian, it's our inherent responsibility to maintain the language. And right now we're at such a critical state that our biggest hope is to document it and make our own people, Richard, realize how critical it is. I think that's our one big challenge. Say, look, we're dying, our language is dying, and we are important, and a lot of this has come about as a result of all these languages being oral.
Yes.
And we're talking about heroes. They were in the stories, passed down, and since we're not doing the language anymore,
Yes.
the children never hear about these heroes that
Yes.
that are in our background, and that's just a tremendous loss.
A lot of times people, non-Indian people, will ask me, well, they don't quite get it. They say, well, why can't you just translate everything into English? Of course, there's always the problem that there's this phrase, it loses in the translation, and that applies. But even beyond that, there are a lot of things, like you say, that might, in the dropping of the language, other things tend to be dropped with it. Some of the things that have been talked about, or songs that have been sung, or stories that have been told in the language don't get translated, because there isn't someone there managing that. And so much has already been lost.
Yes.
And so you can't really separate the saving of the language from the saving of the culture that it
That's
gives
right.
voice to, right?
Yes, right now I think we're at the point of practicing being Indian. It's not far off that we're going to have a bunch of brown, white people running around here and doing things. They're going to call this culture just because they can boil corn or build a fire and dry pumpkin and things like that. They're going to call this culture. It's already being done. We have people that dance around the fire. I went to the Red Earth dancing contest, 2 summers ago, and I just thought it would be kind of amusing to greet all these dancers coming out of this big arena and in their finest feathers, and maybe they were a winner, and I just wanted to talk with them. So I talked with all of them that I could, and I said, I love your costume, I love your outfit. Oh, they were proud. When they walk out, a dancer has that, walk that, hey, I just finished my dance. And I asked them, what tribe are you? And they knew. And I said, do you speak your language? No. I didn't find one of those dancers that I spoke with that could speak their language, and they were representing many, many tribes.
Yes.
And it was a real sad thing for me to do. At first, what I thought would be amusing turned out to be a very sad thing.
So, Richard, or either of you, how do we get that attitude of the proud dancer and put that on the language learner?
Well, I think it does take a lot of different areas of broaching it. The struggle is different for, I think, our larger communities like the Cherokee Nation and the Muskogee Creek Nation, because they have lots of speakers. Many people in the community are not clearly understanding how endangered the language is. There's lots of speakers. They don't realize the great majority of them are elderly.
Right.
And once they pass over, if they haven't learned it, if their kids or grandkids haven't learned it, then that's... Our smaller communities, on the other hand, are more clearly aware of the loss of the language because they can count the number of speakers maybe on two hands. But then they often lack resources. They don't have large amounts of funding in order to address the issues in the same way. So the struggle, I think, is really to take it to our tribal officials, to do it at the state level, to call attention in as many different arenas as possible to try to change those attitudes, raise the awareness.
Of course, as Margaret mentioned, a lot of that struggle is right in the home. We only have 2 minutes left. Maybe I could ask you each to briefly personalize this a little bit about telling the story of your own families. I know you each have children. What happened to language in your families?
Well, number one, I married a white man, and I worked full-time, and I did raise 8 children. They weren't all mine, but I raised them. And in the daily struggle to survive,
Yes.
language just gets kind of put aside, especially if your mate doesn't speak the language
Right.
and it's not important to him. It just doesn't seem important. And I was one of those people that was not aware that the language was dying as fast as it is. It's a frightening thing to realize.
Yes.
How about your family,
Indeed.
Richard?
Well, the last fluent speaker was my grandmother, who grew up speaking only Yuchi, went to boarding school. Part of that generation, in her case, in boarding school, was punished for speaking it. She was too old when she went to really lose the language, but she was convinced that the language was a problem, would get you into. So she didn't allow my father to speak the language. So I heard it from her some growing up, and now we've had to go back, and I've been working to with elders to pass it on to my children and to learn it myself. So we're working at it, but that's kind of our story in a nutshell.
There is so much work to be done, isn't there? Well, in the last 20 seconds, can we put some positive or optimistic, forward-looking view on this? Let me put it this way. What would you suggest to Indian people, both of you, and especially to Indian parents?
Well, I like to see history back, or put in the history books, number one. Indians put in their place in history, so it would give our young an idea of how mighty a people we were.
Yes, and I would just add to have our have a positive attitude. We can learn it. We can pass it forward, even to recognize it.
Keep on keeping on. We're out of time. Thank you both very much for being here and sharing these very important thoughts with us. See you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita.